I never thought I'd be back on this farm. 3 months after Dad's funeral, I finally worked up the courage to visit the property I'd inherited. The old farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered from childhood visits, its white paint peeling like old skin. Weeds had claimed most of what used to be Mom's vegetable garden. Walking toward the barn, memories flooded back. Dad teaching me to milk cows when I was 8. The smell of hay and motor oil that seemed to live in his clothes. How he'd always wave from that old red tractor when I'd visit during college breaks. The barn door creaked as I pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through gaps in the wooden walls. And there it was. Dad's 1952 Farmall tractor, sitting exactly where he'd left it. Red paint faded to rust in places, but somehow still proud-looking. I ran my hand along the worn seat where Dad had spent countless hours. The steering wheel was smooth from decades of his calloused hands. A coffee can sat on the engine housing, filled with bolts and washers. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, like he might walk in any moment and fire it up. But Dad was gone. Heart attack took him while he was watching the evening news. Quick and painless, the doctor said. At least there was that small mercy. I'd been living in the city for 15 years, working in accounting. What did I know about running a farm? The smart thing would be to sell everything and move on, but something kept me standing there, staring at that old tractor. My apartment back in Chicago felt like a different world compared to this place. Concrete and steel instead of fields and sky, the constant hum of traffic instead of birdsong. I'd built a good life there. Decent job, nice girlfriend, all the conveniences of modern living. But standing in this barn, I realized how much I'd missed the simplicity of farm life. The way morning fog rolled across the pastures. How you could see every star in the night sky without light pollution. The satisfaction of working with your hands instead of staring at computer screens all day. Dad never pressured me to stay and work the farm. He understood my need to make my own way in the world. But I always sensed a quiet disappointment when I'd leave after visits, heading back to my city life. This land's been in our family for 4 generations, he'd told me once. But I want you to be happy, son. That's all that matters. Now, looking around the barn, I wondered if I'd made the right choice. The farm wasn't huge, just 40 acres of corn and soybeans, plus the old dairy barn Dad had converted to equipment storage years ago. Nothing fancy, but it had supported our family for decades. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my girlfriend. "How's the farm cleanup going? Ready to list it with a realtor yet?" I stared at the message without responding. Was I ready? The practical part of my brain said yes. Sell everything, take the money, and get back to real life. But my heart wasn't quite ready to let go of this place yet. Maybe I'd stay a few more days, get the old tractor running, clean up the property a bit. Honor Dad's memory properly before saying goodbye forever. The barn held 40 years of Dad's life in its corners. Old harnesses hung from wooden pegs, leather cracked but still strong. Mason jars filled with nails and screws lined makeshift shelves. A calendar from 1987 still hung on the wall, turned to October, the month Mom died. I found Dad's toolbox exactly where he'd always kept it, red metal worn smooth from handling. Inside, every tool had its place. Wrenches arranged by size, screwdrivers sorted by type. Even in death, Dad's methodical nature was evident. A wooden crate caught my eye. Inside were dozens of letters tied with string, correspondence with seed companies, equipment dealers, the county extension office. Dad had kept meticulous records of everything, planting schedules, rainfall measurements, crop yields going back decades. One letter made me pause. It was from the bank, dated just 2 months before Dad died. The farm was in financial trouble. Bigger operations had driven down crop prices, and Dad's old equipment couldn't compete with modern efficiency. He'd been struggling to make payments. Why hadn't he told me? I could have helped. My accounting job paid well enough that I could have sent money, maybe helped him refinance. But Dad was proud. He'd built this place from nothing after coming back from Vietnam, and he wouldn't have wanted to burden his city-dwelling son with rural problems. I sat on an overturned bucket, reading through more letters. Dad had been fighting to save the farm right up until the end. He'd even looked into selling some acreage to developers, though the idea must have killed him inside. The tractor sat silent in the center of it all, like a monument to better times, when Dad was young and strong, when crop prices were fair, when small family farms could still make it. I'd been avoiding the obvious question for 3 days now. Would the old tractor even start? Dad had been meticulous about maintenance, but the machine hadn't run since his death 3 months ago. Farm equipment doesn't like sitting idle. Walking around the farm hall, I checked the obvious things. Oil level looked good. Dad had always been religious about oil changes. Tires were low but not flat. The battery terminals were corroded, but that was fixable. I found jumper cables in Dad's toolbox and pulled my car up to the barn. The battery in my Honda was newer and stronger than whatever was in the tractor. If the old farm hall was going to start, it would need all the help it could get. As I connected the cables, I thought about all the times I'd watched Dad perform this same ritual. He'd taught me to drive on this very tractor when I was 12, my feet barely reaching the pedals. We'd spent summer afternoons cutting hay, Dad patient as I learned to keep straight rows. Farming's not just about growing crops, he'd told me. It's about taking care of the land so it can take care of future generations. I'd rolled my eyes at the time, eager to get back to video games and air conditioning. Now his words carried weight I hadn't understood as a kid. The jumper cables were connected. I climbed onto the worn metal seat and looked at the familiar controls. Throttle, clutch, PTO lever, all exactly where they'd always been. My hands remembered the sequence even after all these years. I turned the key to the on position and listened. No obvious problems. The fuel gauge showed half full. Dad must have topped it off before he couldn't anymore. Time to see if the old girl still had life in her. My hand hesitated on the starter button. Once I pressed it, there would be no going back to the quiet contemplation of the past few days. The tractor would either roar to life or confirm that this chapter of our family's story was truly over. I pushed the button. The starter motor cranked slowly, turning the engine over with mechanical determination. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. I waited a moment and tried again. The battery was strong, but the engine seemed reluctant to wake from its long sleep. On the 4th attempt, something changed. A cough. A sputter. Then suddenly the engine caught. The familiar rumble of the old farm hall filled the barn, deeper and more powerful than I remembered. Blue-grey exhaust began pouring from the vertical stack. But something was wrong. Mixed with the normal exhaust smoke, something else was coming out of the pipe. Something that made my heart stop. Hundreds of small white objects were floating out with the exhaust, caught in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the barn door. At first I thought it was debris, maybe paper or leaves, that had somehow gotten into the exhaust system. But as they settled to the barn floor around me, I realized what they were. Flower petals. Hundreds and hundreds of dried flower petals, preserved somehow in the exhaust pipe and now dancing through the air like snow. I shut off the engine and climbed down, my hands shaking. Kneeling on the barn floor, I picked up a handful of the petals. They were delicate, papery with age, but I could still make out their original colors: white, pink, yellow, the colors of Mom's favorite flowers. Baby's breath, roses, daisies. All flowers that had grown in Mom's garden, flowers that Dad had tended faithfully for 15 years after she died, even though he claimed he didn't know anything about gardening. How had they gotten into the exhaust pipe, and why? I sat in the barn for an hour, surrounded by flower petals, trying to understand what I'd discovered. Dad had always been a practical man. He fixed what was broken, planted what would grow, and didn't waste time on sentiment, or so I'd thought. But these flowers told a different story. I remembered now how Dad would disappear for hours every Sunday after church. He'd said he was checking fences or maintaining equipment, but I'd never paid much attention. I was usually eager to get back to the city, to my own life. Walking to the house, I found myself really looking at the property for the first time since arriving. Behind the house, where Mom's vegetable garden used to be, someone had planted flowers. Lots of them. Roses climbed a trellis Dad had built. Daisies bordered a small path. Baby's breath filled in the spaces between. It wasn't a wild, overgrown garden. Someone had been caring for it, weeding it, keeping it neat. Dad had been maintaining Mom's flowers all these years, even expanding the garden, though he'd never mentioned it to me. A small wooden bench sat in the center of the garden, positioned to face the sunset. On it was a mason jar filled with dried flowers, the same varieties I'd found in the tractor exhaust. I picked up the jar and unscrewed the lid. Inside was a folded piece of paper, Dad's careful handwriting visible through the glass. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and read, "For my beloved Helen, I know you're not really gone, just waiting in a better place. I save these flowers for you every year, hoping somehow you'll know I haven't forgotten, that I'll never forget. Your loving husband, Frank." The paper was dated just 2 weeks before Dad died. He'd been coming here, talking to Mom, saving flowers for her. And somehow, he'd found a way to make sure I'd discover his secret. I spent the rest of the day piecing together Dad's final gift to me. In his workshop, I found evidence of careful planning. A notebook filled with measurements and sketches, photos of the tractor's exhaust system, even a rough timeline written in Dad's methodical handwriting. He'd known he was dying, maybe not the exact day, but he'd felt it coming. The heart problems had been getting worse, though he'd hidden that from me too. And in his final weeks, he'd devised this elaborate way to share his secret. The exhaust pipe had been carefully modified. Dad had created a small chamber where the pipe curved, just large enough to hold several mason jars full of dried flowers. When the engine started after months of sitting idle, the initial blast of exhaust would blow the flowers out like confetti. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Why not just leave me a letter explaining about the garden? I found the answer in another notebook, this one filled with Dad's thoughts about the farm's future. He'd known I'd probably sell the place. It was the practical thing to do, and Dad had raised me to be practical. But he'd also hoped that maybe, just maybe, I'd understand what this place really meant. The farm isn't just land and buildings, he'd written. It's where love lives. Where your mother and I built our life together, where we raised you, where I've kept her memory alive every day since she's been gone. He'd known that seeing the flowers, understanding his secret garden, might change my mind about selling. It was his last attempt to help me see what I'd be giving up, and it was working. Sitting in his workshop, surrounded by the evidence of his love for Mom and for this place, I felt something shifting inside me. The city life I'd built suddenly seemed hollow compared to this. The flower petals were just the beginning. Once I started looking with new eyes, I found evidence of Dad's hidden sentimental side everywhere. In the old dairy barn, behind stacks of equipment, I discovered a workshop I'd never known existed. Dad had been building things. Not practical farm implements, but beautiful wooden furniture. A rocking chair with Mum's initials carved into the headrest. A hope chest decorated with hand-painted flowers. A dining table that would seat 8, though Dad had lived alone for 15 years. Each piece was finished to perfection, sanded smooth and stained with care. But they'd never left the workshop. Dad had been creating a home for a family that existed only in his memory and dreams. I found photo albums too, carefully preserved in waterproof containers. Pictures of Mom and Dad when they were young, working the farm together. Photos of me as a child, helping with chores, riding on Dad's shoulders. Images of family gatherings from decades past, when the farm was full of life and laughter. One album was different. It contained photos Dad had taken over the past 15 years. All of the farm through the seasons. Spring planting, summer growth, fall harvest, winter rest. Page after page of the land he'd loved, documented like a love letter to the place itself. The final pages showed the flower garden. Photos of Mom's roses blooming each year, the daisies spreading, new varieties Dad had added. In the last photo, taken just weeks before he died, Dad had captured the garden at sunset, golden light making everything glow. On the back, he'd written, "For Tommy, so you'll understand why this place matters. Love, Dad." He'd been planning this revelation for months, maybe years. Every detail designed to help me see what I'd been too busy to notice during my brief visits home. That evening, I called Sarah from the farmhouse kitchen. The old rotary phone still worked, though it took her a moment to recognize the number. "Tommy," I was starting to worry. "How's the cleanup going?" I looked out the window at Mom's garden, visible in the fading light. "It's complicated." "Oh, what do you mean, complicated? It's just old farm stuff, right? Have you called a realtor yet?" How could I explain what I'd discovered? The flower petals, the secret workshop, the evidence of Dad's deep love for this place. It would sound crazy to someone who'd never known him. "Sarah, what if I didn't sell? What if I stayed and tried to make the farm work?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "Tommy, you're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. You have a good job here, a life here. You don't know anything about farming." She was right, of course. I was an accountant, not a farmer. I knew spreadsheets and tax codes, not soil conditions and crop rotation. The practical thing would be to sell the farm and get back to my real life. But sitting in Dad's kitchen, surrounded by his memories, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe my real life wasn't as real as I'd thought. Maybe I'd been sleepwalking through 15 years of city living, missing what actually mattered. "I need more time to think," I told Sarah. "How much more time? Your boss is already asking when you'll be back." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to leave yet. Not when I was just beginning to understand who my father really was and maybe who I was supposed to be. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said, and hung up before she could argue. I decided to spend one more week on the farm, trying to understand Dad's daily life. I woke with the sunrise, as he always had, and walked the property boundaries. 40 acres didn't sound like much in the abstract, but walking every fence line took most of the morning. The land was in better shape than I'd expected. Dad had kept the fences repaired, the drainage ditches clear. The soil looked rich and dark, ready for spring planting. He'd been taking care of this place right up until the end, even while struggling financially. I found his journals in the kitchen, detailed records of weather, crop yields, expenses, and income going back decades. Dad had been a meticulous record keeper, noting everything from rainfall amounts to the first frost date each year. Reading through recent entries, I began to understand the challenges he'd faced. Corporate farms with thousands of acres could plant and harvest more efficiently than a small operation like ours. They could negotiate better prices for seed and fertilizer, get better rates from grain elevators. But Dad had found ways to compete. He'd diversified into specialty crops, heirloom corn varieties that restaurants would pay premium prices for. He'd sold directly to local markets instead of going through corporate middlemen. He'd been innovative, adaptive, fighting to keep the farm viable. The financial problems weren't from poor management or laziness. They were the result of an economic system that favored large operations over small family farms. Dad had been swimming against a tide that had swept away thousands of farms like ours, yet he'd never given up. Even in his final months, the journals showed him researching new crops, new markets, new ways to make the farm profitable. He'd been planning for a future he wouldn't live to see. Maybe he'd been planning for me to see it instead. On my last planned day at the farm, I sat in Mum's garden as the sun set, surrounded by the flowers Dad had tended with such secret devotion. The evening air was soft and warm, filled with the scent of roses and the distant sound of cattle lowing in a neighbor's pasture. My phone had been buzzing all day with messages from Sarah, from my boss, from the life I'd built in Chicago. They all wanted the same thing, for me to come back to reality, to stop this foolish romantic notion about farming. But sitting here, I realized that maybe this was reality. Maybe the concrete and steel of the city was the illusion, and this connection to the land, to family history, to something larger than myself was what was real. I thought about Dad's final gift, not just the flower petals, but the revelation of his hidden depths. He'd been so much more than the practical, unemotional man I'd thought I knew. He'd been a romantic, a dreamer, a man who'd spent 15 years talking to his dead wife in a secret garden, and he'd believed in something worth preserving, not just the farm as a business, but as a way of life, a connection to the land that fed people, a stewardship of soil and water and growing things that would outlast any individual life. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah. "Tommy, thank God. When are you coming home?" "I am home," I said, looking out at the fields Dad had worked for 40 years. "This is home. I'm staying." The argument that followed was painful, but not unexpected. Sarah couldn't understand how I could throw away everything we'd built together for a failing farm in the middle of nowhere. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But as I hung up the phone and walked back toward the house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace, purpose, the sense that I was finally where I belonged. 6 months later, I was still learning to read weather patterns, to time plantings, to coax life from soil. The learning curve was steep, and I made plenty of mistakes. But I had help. Neighbors who remembered Dad fondly and were willing to share their knowledge with his city boy son. The farm was slowly becoming profitable again. I'd followed Dad's lead, focusing on specialty crops and direct sales. A local restaurant chain had contracted for all my heirloom tomatoes. The farmer's market in town was eager for my organic herbs and flowers. Yes, flowers. I'd expanded Mum's garden into a small commercial operation, selling cut flowers to florists and wedding planners. It seemed fitting that the flowers Dad had grown in secret would help save the farm he'd loved. I'd kept the old farm all running, though I'd bought a newer tractor for the heavy work. Sometimes in the evenings I'd start the old red machine, just to hear its familiar rumble, to remember the day the flower petals had changed everything. The farmhouse was slowly coming back to life too. I'd moved Dad's handmade furniture from the workshop into the house, finally putting it to use. The dining table that seated 8 was ready for the family gatherings I hoped to host someday. I missed Sarah sometimes, missed the convenience of city life. But I'd found something here that I'd never had in Chicago, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than myself. Standing in the barn where it all began, I could almost feel Dad's presence, his approval. He'd known what this place could mean to me, even when I didn't know it myself. His final gift hadn't just been the revelation of his secret garden. It had been the chance to discover who I really was. The flower petals were long gone, swept away by barn breezes. But their message remained, growing stronger with each passing season. Some things are worth preserving, some places are worth fighting for. And sometimes the most important gifts come disguised as exhaust smoke on a sunny afternoon. Thank you so much for listening to this story about love, loss, and the unexpected gifts our family members leave behind. I hope it reminded you that sometimes the most precious treasures are hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for us to discover them when we're ready. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please tell me what part of the world you're listening from, and if you have any similar stories about discovering hidden sides of your loved ones. Your stories help build this wonderful community we have here. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more heartwarming tales that celebrate the connections between generations and the power of family love. Until next time, take care of each other, and remember to look for the hidden gardens in your own life.